International commodity trading is highly dependent on the world of politics. Now, 2014 has been plagued, as we know, by sanctions, crisis and disease. And as such, the effect on the trading industry may be very real. With me in the studio to discuss is Richard Watts. Richard, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you again, Richard. Now, if we talk about sanctions, the whole discussion, perhaps the focus, has maybe, subsided in the last few months, as it were, at the early start of the year. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the effects are not being felt still at present. To your mind, though, what are we experiencing here?
Well, we might be speaking about sanctions a little bit less in the media, but they're still very, very present and they're still affecting business an awful lot. As we've discussed in the past, sanctions are a very efficient and cost-effective way of waging war against a country, and they're also a very good way of raising funds in terms of penalties. Now, the problems with sanctions is that they're not always as clear as they could be, they're not predictable, and the penalties are not always that fair or clear or transparent. If we take, for example, the fine that's been imposed on BNP recently in the region of $9 billion, nobody's capable of explaining where that $9 billion figure came from. It just seems to have been plucked out of the air. And so there's no transparency of where that money is going to go. Also, if we look at the way that the sanctions are actually put in place, it's very difficult to have predictability. If we look at the sanctions that were placed on Russian individuals earlier in this year, when the rules first came out, they said that the sanctions, any company which was owned by one of those individuals, more than 50% of the company, would be on the sanctions list. So it's quite straightforward. Then they changed the rule and said that any company which is owned by one or more of those individuals, or for 50%, would then be on the sanctions list. And I think KPMG put together a list of companies affected, and we're talking of close to 1,000 companies.
Yeah, as you say, terms which are thrown about, but perhaps are not completely understood by one and all. But if we turn a little bit to Ebola, also something which has had a huge effect on the world, has been hugely spoken about, but in all honesty, from a media point of view, more so on the airline industry, on passengers and how it would affect their journeys. From your point of view, from the trading, from commodities, from shipping, what has been the effect really?
Well, it's taken a long time for it to have had a serious effect in shipping and trading, but now that it has, it's becoming a very large issue. The countries that are affected by Ebola at the moment are countries which import an awful lot of goods. The main goods they import are foodstuff and energy, so petrol. And so obviously there are a lot of vessels going to these ports, and these vessels are having trouble getting to the ports and being able to berth. And these goods are a staple requirement of the local population, and obviously the knock-on effect is that the prices go up, and so this is having a negative effect on the people who are already suffering from Ebola.
Now, you say these type of countries which are dependent on these goods, but geographically, who is being the most affected, would you say?
Well, we effectively have the three countries which are the most affected. So we have Liberia, we have Guinea, and we have Sierra Leone. And so what this means from a shipping point of view is that the port of Liberia is Monrovia, for Guinea it's Conakry, and for Sierra Leone it's Freetown. And these are quite major ports. They're ports with a lot of vessels usually going in and out of them, and so there are a lot of imports, anything from, as I said, petrol all the way over to rice, but there's also exports coming out of these countries. And the problem is that they're very, very difficult to work with, these ports at the moment, and some of the other neighbouring countries are also having knock-on effects at the moment.
Now that's obviously one side of the logistical problems, but what also about the knock-on effects in terms of the ship owners and also the traders, really?
Now, different countries have reacted differently to the situation, and for example, some countries have instigated a 21-day quarantine for vessels that have called previously at an Ebola-affected country. Now, 21 days quarantine, these vessels can be costing up to $10,000 per day, and so it becomes very, very expensive. Now, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, has tried to issue some kind of guidelines to ship owners in order to remove some of the panic and actually make sure that people know what the situation is and know what they're doing.
And Richard, to pick you up on some of the points you've made there about the contract, what are the ramifications being experienced here? Are people trying to pull out of contracts which they made before the outbreak, or what's really happening?
But we don't see people trying to pull out of contracts because there are some quite serious consequences, but we do see people looking very, very closely at the clauses they have in the contracts. Now, the most important contract we're talking about is the charter party, and that's the contract that links the charterers and the ship owners, as I said. Now, in that there's already a quarantine clause, and so there's already a clause that says if there is a quarantine imposed after the signing of the contract, then it would be for the ship owner's account, the time lost. Now we see more and more ship owners are trying to insert what is called the Ebola clause into charter parties, which outlines exactly who is responsible for what. And this clause, basically you end up in a situation where if your vessel has discharged in a port which is affected by Ebola, and then you finish with the vessel goes on to do another voyage, but there is a delay, you can be held responsible for that delay.
Okay. Now, with that in mind, how can industry players protect themselves from all these different goings-on?
Well, there are a number of ways of protecting, and I think it's really about thinking in advance, actually being prepared. And so as far as the trade is concerned, it's a question of knowing what clauses you have in your contract, what your obligations are, and what you can do within those contracts. As far as the ship owners are concerned, it is very much a question of protecting their crew and making sure that when they do go to these ports, they don't have any danger of becoming infected. And so we see a number of items being put in place. For example, whenever a vessel goes to port, you have to have the customs official come on board, you have all the different officials come on board, and so now they have systems in place. I mean, we see here, they've put plastic bags over the chairs, they give everyone suits to protect themselves, and so they're making sure that there's no chance of being infected. There are ship owners at the moment who are putting up cordons around their vessels to make sure that nobody has access to the vessels, and this allows them to carry on doing business with the countries that are concerned without having too much risk.
Well, as you say, Richard, it has to be business as usual. The show must go on, not without its consequences. And thank you so much for coming in and shedding some light on this really interesting topic. It's been a pleasure chatting it through with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, that's all from Richard and myself for the moment. There is plenty more coming your way here from the Dukascopy TV studio, so make sure you keep on clicking back to the website. Goodbye for now.